Hi, class. How are you today? I'm here with Christopher Jordan, who is a licensed behavioral analyst in the state of Virginia. And I have asked Chris to join me to tell me a little bit about a crisis experience he had when he was early on in his career. So, Chris, I know you were talking to me at one point about one of your clients who kind of was having a lot of crises all at once. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, for the purposes of this story, we can kind of call him John. We had some trouble with John. He was in our program for a reason. And the property manager had been hearing complaint after complaint about him. And on a Friday afternoon, it came to a head, and the property manager had reached out to me, called me, and asked if I could come and intervene and um, see if I could help mitigate a situation. I wasn't really quite sure what was happening, but I knew that she had really had it up to here with him, and she too was pretty stressed out. And to be quite honest with you, pretty much majority of people who interacted with this individual um, often had that kind of feeling, which was kind of a loss as to what to do.
Yeah. And just to clarify, part of your job, part of, within the agency you were working in was to make sure that John had adequate housing. That was a big part of the task for you guys working with John, right?
Correct. So that was the primary. It was not a clinical program per se, and it was not considered clinical work, although our population was exclusively individuals who had a psychiatric diagnosis. And in this situation, he was also had a diagnosis of a moderate intellectual disability
Okay.
and hearing impaired as well. And on top of that, he had been, some kind of a lot of noncompliance, antisocial behaviors. He would not participate in any kind of programming for sign language. And if and when he did have scheduled appointments that could facilitate that and leverage that kind of device to communicate with, he was often fairly reluctant and pretty just difficult to work with day in and day out.
Wow.
So it was, I had some semblance that that afternoon could be difficult, but once I got there, I realized that he had gotten himself into a pretty serious situation. He had slapped a 10-year-old boy, or excuse me, a 13-year-old boy
Wow.
across the face in a pretty aggressive manner, not playful. And his mother and his siblings were there, and I saw them. I didn't interact with them directly, but that was what I understood the situation once I got there.
And just to be clear, this is an adult patient with the intellectual disability slapped a 13-year-old child.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was pretty difficult, and as we can imagine, it's if we're not aware someone does have a disability, particularly when it comes to recognizing age limits and appropriate boundaries, um, people get pretty thrown off by that.
Yeah,
It can be it can be very hard to detect, and particularly if it's your child. I mean, you're going to be concerned, and from what I also understand, this was not the first time that there had been some conflict either with this particular family. And what I understood was that this family could not really adequately communicate their concerns. They may have had some concerns about their residency, their status, and just their opportunity to continue living in that apartment community. So their recourse was limited from what I understood at the time.
And so you were called to essentially remove John from the premises and find somewhere else for him to go permanently. Was
Correct.
okay.
So the kind of what I might add to that is I think that the push was to really get him out of that situation off premises for at least some kind of indeterminate amount of time, but eventually he was going to be removed permanently.
Okay.
Just because it had become so untenable to try to take advantage of the supports that he had to try to corral some of his impulsivity. And so again, if that makes sense, it was I think step one was to try to get him out of there, at least to get him off site, so that the tensions could simmer down. And then two was to really, if I could seize that opportunity to get him out of there permanently, that would be the day.
And so tell me how did you communicate with him, being that he was hearing impaired? Um, you're not as familiar with sign language, perhaps as other people. How were you able to sort of communicate with him and de-escalate that situation?
It was really difficult because, as you said, I mean, I don't know sign language, and had sign language been available as a means to communicate, I would have made some attempt to contact an agency that could help me with sign language. So to kind of take it a step further, getting John to use sign language was often problematic in of itself. So again, it kind of circled back to the question: is how to communicate with him was often really just rule number one is to always stay composed and understand that anything less than composure, your own composure, that is, um, it's just certainly not going to help. I mean, your composure is really your best asset in terms of communicating. You want to kind of uh, hopefully have that rub off in the best way it can. You know, you can take the stress, you can take the confusion, you can take the combustibility of a situation, but if you're not rattled, that's going to give that other person an opportunity to hopefully see that there's another way to behave, comport, and make decisions,
Yeah.
choices.
Like being calm, remaining calm, that's kind of a universal language. So it sort of it has that mirroring effect for our clients.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think it's well said.
And had you worked with John in the past? Did you have a good rapport with him, or was this your first time meeting with John?
I had worked with him in the past on a limited basis. I had had some interactions with him, but again, just limited, sporadic, nothing too regular. Um, again, it was some time ago. I don't know if we had certain individuals assigned to us. So, but I had met him in the past. I'd been in some meetings with him, with some other providers with him. I had understood his profile to a degree. So it was new, but to the extent that we had communicated, I think it was through paper and pen, and even that was kind of ambiguous as far as trying to get something concrete in terms of understanding his preferences and understanding what it is that I could do for him to help improve his experience, either it be the apartment, finding an alternative, helping him uh, be placed in a situation where he can experience things that are things that he likes and trying to avoid things he doesn't like. So I probably met with him maybe a total of maybe 4 or 5 times beforehand.
Yeah. So you have to kind of think outside the box sometimes with these cases. And so, Chris, part of your job was to transport clients, right, in your own vehicle. That was a part of the process for getting your clients hooked up with various resources. And I understand at one point you were transporting John and actually had to pull the car over. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So at the time, that was very much a part of that particular job and that responsibility. It was almost in tandem with each session was to kind of expect that the client is going to be in the car with you at some point. So I did have some experience with that with some other clients, but in this instance, it was particularly difficult because prior to John getting to my vehicle, the idea was to hopefully convince him that the situation where he was living, was becoming increasingly difficult. The mother with the child and her children, whom he had reportedly slapped, they were within that proximity there. And we were standing in a parking lot, and we had the maintenance workers there. And they had also been complaining, for lack of a better way of stating, their concerns with John. And then lastly, we had another neighbor approach us, and he had mentioned that John had been knocking on his door with cigarette for asking for cigarettes in the middle of the night,
Hmm.
and that he had a gun, and he had at least considered being prepared. So as to that conversation didn't go much further than that, but it certainly served to understand that that particular community was had reached their limits with John, and that getting him out of that immediate situation was really important.
Yeah.
And whether John understood that or not, what I could convey is that he could get into my car, and something that you had said earlier is trying to lean on that universal language of composure and really kind of conveying that there is a rapport there, whether or not it's been well established. The potential for it is there. So I welcomed him into my car. I don't know if it was clear to him as to where we were going, but I did my very best to. Again, it was pretty tricky to convey, but we were going to the hospital. The hospital is a place where you could seek refuge and trying to get some help.
Yeah.
And so once John got into the vehicle, um, I think one could say there could be an episode of psychosis, but his demeanor really changed, and he seemed to get quite aggressive to a point where trying to talk to him or to communicate with him on any level uh, felt real dangerous. And we were at a light, and I think he was grabbing things. I can't quite remember the details, but um, above all else, it just became an unsafe situation. And as we rounded the corner, I parked in the parking lot of a bank and uh, tried my very best to convey to him that he needed to find a way to compose himself. Otherwise, I had no choice but to not have him in the car,
Yeah.
which is something I was really reluctant to do. I mean, it's unprofessional to simply pick somebody up and drop them off. But when you're in a car, you've got a individual in your passenger side, and when you're on a road, you're part of a community of drivers. So it's not just you're worrying about, but you're worrying about the other drivers and driving safety. Fortunately, John came to some extent, and we made our way to the hospital.
That's excellent. And I know you had talked about a lot of different barriers when you got to the hospital, but at the end, how did it end? Were you able to get John to a safe place?
I'd like to think that I was able to get John to excuse me, a safer place. We had attempted to go directly to the inpatient hospitalization for psychiatric purposes. And at that time, the policy was to route each and every single individual through the emergency room. And as we can imagine with emergency rooms or emergency departments, they're pretty wide ranging in terms of population, conditions, severity, and so forth. So the particular emergency room still didn't feel quite safe just yet. I felt like the safest thing for him was to have either inpatient hospitalization, and unfortunately, he just didn't have family at that time that was reliable. I later found out he had a dad who was in the area. But for the time being, we'd had some nurses approach John. I think at one point he had spit or spat in their face, um, and he was combative with the staff. And so I think in those kind of situations, what's very stressful about that is I think in an emergency room, a lot of the emergency personnel, they really have to pick their battles because every situation they're dealing with are real medical emergencies.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that this was not one of them, but on the hierarchy of emergencies, this may have been something that they felt was uh, something that they had to pick and reprioritize. So the system of support started to thin. And that's when a security guard and another security guard entered the picture. And I took some solace in that in terms of safety and trying to at least symbolize to John that, there was security there and kind of just the symbolism of having larger figures and maybe trying to kind of convey that kind of strength in numbers, authority in that sense. Um, but I don't think it stopped there. I didn't really see where it was going to end. And I think in hindsight, knowing that sticking it out and being incredibly patient, that's going to really help your crisis situations. I think is that knowing that there's a positive outcome that can come through this and allowing that person to process it in a way that it's safe. And I don't know if I recall the exact details of how things ended, but I do recall that he was not admitted to inpatient hospitalization, which was stressful. And because we didn't know what was going to come of it, but he eventually did return home. And I do know that several weeks later, he was promptly evicted.
Okay.
And
Wow.
unfortunately, he had to find alternative housing, which was kind of the nature of our program, which we were able to help them with.
Okay. So in the long run, you were able to help them find alternative housing. But it sounds like, that crisis sort of had all the elements of a crisis. It was a client who had a mental health disorder, intellectual disability, hearing impaired, very aggressive, and on top of that, perhaps even in an acute psychosis. And, what I find to be really admirable is your ability throughout that whole thing to think quickly, to keep the rapport, but also keep your safety in mind and have all of those things into consideration at one time, so early on in your career.
Thank you. It just simply doesn't help to lose your composure, to take something personally, which it's not personal. It's really about that individual. It's not just your job; it's just a human thing to do. This person has a disability, and if it doesn't have a neurological component, this person just simply does not have the same resources as one might to just simply cope in a way that's going to be more efficient and safe. And it didn't make me angry. There were times where I was concerned about how things would shake out. But something like that, it's just when it comes to crisis, I mean, that person is really agonizing. Is it really, I think, bottom
Yeah,
line.
definitely. And I think, having a client where they have the resources, we've provided them the resources, they don't want to utilize the resources, but not taking that personally and still giving them our very best at any given moment, it's amazing. The stuff is amazing. So, Chris, thank you so much for talking to me today. I think my students are going to get a lot out of that story, and I really appreciate it and can't wait to talk to you again.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.